You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
Welcome to the Occult Rejects. In this episode, we will be continuing off of part one that we did with Justin from LDSabuse. I'm really thoroughly loving this topic. It was something that really took me off guard. I really was not expecting this. Be totally honest with you, I'm very jealous and wish I would have came across this, but at least somebody did. And it's just really weird. And I would probably say Justin probably researches probably just as much as me, if not more. And within like a week or two, this guy had enough for another show. So, and which I was hoping, because I was even like, yo, you think you might be able to do a part two? And he's like, yeah, I think so. And then I hit him back up. I was like, what do you think? He's like, oh yeah, for sure. I was like, yes. So we got him back on. Luckily, a few weeks later, I really appreciate how you really did have. That was a fast turnaround time, actually. Tell you the truth, for a guest to come back on unexpectedly for a part two, very impressive. And he does bring his receipts. So if people have the chance, it's not to promote the video platforms, but I do suggest if you have the chance, if you can check out the video, you go over to YouTube, Rumble, or BitChute. And check out the video, because he will have like a graph and a timeline and everything. And I really appreciate that too. So I guess like enough out of us. I got the co-host of the Occult Rejects, the mad scientist herself, Liza. I got her with me. Thank you very much. Always appreciate it. And Justin, I'll let you plug your stuff, and then if you want, you can take it away.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me back. It has been sort of a wild ride, and it's been really fun to do this research. And I wish I could take credit for coming up with the topic, but it really sort of fell in my lap. And it was just one of those veins when you kind of it doesn't stop bleeding, right? And tonight, I think we're gonna sort of close the gaps that were, when I was on first, it was very, very new. And in the last couple of weeks, I've been able to sort of show this, what I'm calling the unholy alliance between the Mormon Church and Rotary International and the United Nations, right? And we can talk about it. I mean, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but maybe not so much. I don't know. But I think we can draw that line from literally the time that Rotary was brought into existence all the way to the present, and show how basically just how deeply ingrained Rotary International is in like modern Mormon life, right? Especially at that leadership level in what I call the Mormon aristocracy over there in Salt Lake City. So without further ado, we can just hop right in. And I do want to start a little bit before Rotary was brought into existence, because one of the really surprising things that I found that, even members of the church probably have really never heard about, outside of maybe a few people, is this, what I call the Wilford Woodruff Sugar Company revelation. And this is a really fascinating part of Mormon history that you're not going to get taught at church ever. But what we found here is that the church was in a lot of trouble financially. The leadership of the church had made a lot of really poor choices. And as individuals and as an institution, they were in a lot of trouble. And Wilford Woodruff is a really interesting character in church history. And I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I think we can sort of start by judging him by this revelation that he claims to have from Jesus Christ. This is how Mormonism works. And so what Wilford Woodruff said in 1891 is this. He says, "Now the inspiration of the Lord, meaning Jesus Christ, to me is to build this factory," meaning a sugar factory. "Every time I think of abandoning it, there is darkness. And every time I think of building it, there is light." And then I think this is a really fascinating quote from Wilford Woodruff that people should really think about. He says, "We will build the factory if it bursts the church." So Wilford Woodruff, the prophet of the Mormon Church, is looking for a way to help himself and George Q. Cannon and Heber J. Grant and all these church leaders out of debt. And he claims to get divine revelation to build a sugar factory, like to build a sugar factory, and not just a sugar factory, but they really want to utilize beet sugar as a main way of getting out of debt. And you can see the influence of this. I didn't put a lot of examples because I already have too much for tonight, but you can see that these church leaders then literally go into the what are called the wards and stakes of the church, which is just the congregations. And they're literally saying things like, in general conference, you'll have one of the apostles saying, well, look, if you don't contribute money to this sugar factory product, then you might be a Mormon, but you're no saint, right? And so they're really turning the screws on the members of the church in order to get themselves out of debt. And Heber J. Grant, who was later the prophet of the church, testifies to the importance of this quote unquote revelation that Wilford Woodruff receives about sugar. And he says, but for the inspiration of the Lord to Wilford Woodruff, I doubt if we would have any sugar business in this state or in Idaho today that would amount to very much. So the reason I want to start there is just, one of the things when you grow up in the Mormon church is you get this idea that Mormon history is somehow different from all other human history, and that, you're part of a group of chosen people and these kinds of things. But really, when you start really digging into Mormon history, what I found is that Mormon history is just human history. And this particular story starts in a very normal way, which is financial troubles, which a lot of us can relate to, right? And so in order to find their way out of religious trouble, Wilford Woodruff comes up with this revelation about getting into the sugar industry, and we can talk about, one of the revelations in the church is called the Word of Wisdom. And it's like a health code for Mormons. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that. You can ask any questions you want about that. But certainly sugar consumption is not part of the Word of Wisdom. And yet, despite the fact that our standard works contain these instructions about how to take care of our bodies, Wilford Woodruff and his buddies, when they're in debt, decide to turn to sugar to get themselves out of the problem, which is more than a little ironic, I think. So in addition to hitting the church members up for cash, they found that they needed additional capital. And so you can see in the historical record that Woodruff starts sending people out on what they're calling financial missions, which again is just sort of a really interesting, as a person who grew up in the church, you just don't think about a mission as something like what Heber J. Grant was doing. And so you can read here, it says, after Cutler presented the money, Woodruff informed him that the church would call Apostle Heber J. Grant as a financial agent to raise additional funds. So we don't know each other very well, and I don't know if you guys read the Bible or not, but I like to do this thing on my Twitter account where I talk about the acts of the modern apostles and compare them to the acts of the ancient apostles. And I don't remember anywhere in my Bible it talking about sending Paul, or any of the apostles out on to be financial agents to raise additional funds, right? That doesn't seem to me to be what the original apostles of Jesus Christ were about. But in the Mormon church around 1898, that's exactly what's going on. The apostles are going out and they're going back east to places like Chicago, New York, and Boston. And they're just trying to raise money to get the equipment to get into this industry, right? So that's sort of the precursor here and I just want to sort of lay that groundwork. And I think we talked about that a little bit in that part one interview that we did, but I just want people to understand that like the infusion of East Coast capital and then the infusion of people into Utah historically is really interesting, because when you look at that historical record, theoretically, the members of the church were being driven from the east to the west, and then Brigham Young presented it as this escape from Babylon to establish Zion. But as soon as they get to Utah, Brigham Young turns around and asks if the East will build a railroad through Utah. And then when that doesn't get them on a financially stable footing and they find themselves in trouble, they turn straight back east and get into this sugar business. So I have a lot more up on my Twitter account if people want to go look. I have several threads about this. And it's really fascinating to see like who was running the sugar trust. They compare it to the Rockefellers, right? Like, so you have the Standard Oil, and they have to bust that trust. And in the sugar industry, I think it was Haverman is the name. But it's the same thing. They compare it. and the Mormon Church got deeply, deeply wrapped up with East Coast capital and East Coast influence. And then, as we're going to see, that East Coast influence comes into Utah in a very, very interesting way, I think. So if you skip a couple decades up ahead after they get this capital, and there's sort of this infusion of East Coast philosophy and East Coast individuals into Utah as Utah gets ready for statehood, and then they get statehood and they send off Reed Smoot to Washington. What you end up seeing is over at the University of Utah, you get the founding of Skull and Bones. And I think we talked about this a little bit last time, but this is directly from Yale, and we have that documented in the Utonian, which is the University of Utah yearbook. This particular screenshot that I took today just shows this is the year that they spun it up, and we can read it here. It says Skull and Bones, and it says merely a bunch of juniors, principally men, which means exclusively men, up for almost 100 years. But it says, which was organized towards the close of school. The purpose of the club is to advance the general interests of the school in general and the junior class in particular, to break up antagonism between fraternities and between frat men and those who do not belong to fraternities. The society is a secret one, and their ways are deep and mysterious. The members propose to establish such an organization in the class of 1911 next year, with the hopes that it may live in the junior class forevermore. Now, we know from other sources that there is a Yale influence here in the faculty, but I've never been able to find that name quite yet, but we'll dig it out eventually. But the name that I wanted to point out here that I thought was interesting is this W.R. King. And the reason I think this is interesting is you start seeing some family names that really get their hooks in there in Utah, and King is one of those names. And for those who don't know, if you were to go look at the governor's race of Utah in 2024, you're going to find a King that's running for that office right now. And so this influence goes all the way from early 1900s all the way to today, right?
Damn.
So the reason that I want to show that too is because you see that King name over at Skull and Bones. The other thing you see is that in 1911, the person who spins up Rotary in Salt Lake City is a man by the name of Wesley E. King. So I have one of the great things about being an ex-Mormon, and being a Mormon in general, but like being Mormon, you learn a lot about how to do family history and genealogy, and the church gives you a lot of great tools on how to do this. And so when two people are dead, you can look and find the relationships between people. And if you look up these two Kings, what you'll see is that they're 11th cousins. Now, that may seem like sort of a distant relationship, but the thing I just want to point out is that it's not 11th cousins twice removed or 11th cousins 4 times removed. They're literally straight down the line. And I'm not going to go into it too much, but if you go look at this and you go look at their common ancestor, he was a wealthy landowner in England. And England plays a really, really important part in this story that I actually don't talk about in this timeline very much, but I'm going to take just 1 second and touch on this. Because what you see is in Salt Lake City, especially along what they call the East Bench, they send most of their boys to England for their missions. And then they've created what they call the Windsor Club. And the Windsor Club, and then the wives are called the Merry Wives of Windsor. And it's just another social club, which, again, I don't think most Mormons understand that almost all of the leadership of the church is basically frat boys and members of things like Rotary or other social clubs. And one of those really exclusive clubs is the Windsor Club. And that was included, it was really started by Gordon B. Hinckley, who ran both the intelligence arm and the propaganda arm of the church, starting basically from the time he came back from his mission in England. So you don't really see them mention that until they die. And then in a lot of obituaries, you'll find so-and-so was a member of Windsor Club, or so-and-so was one of the Merry Wives of Windsor. And so this idea, I haven't fleshed it out fully yet, but I think that there's a really important piece of this about bloodlines, right?
Yeah.
And it really goes to Scotland, and it really goes to Germany, and it really goes to England, with England really being one of the prime locations where the Mormon aristocracy sort of just continually sends their children there to go serve missions and then become part of these social clubs that when they come back, they get fed into this system that includes things like Rotary and so on and so forth. So I'm going to stop here for just 1 second and let you guys ask any questions if you want to, because this is sort of a natural breaking point. But do you guys have anything you wanted to ask up to this point?
Go ahead if you have
I
anything.
don't. I don't. Just the constant association of German Jewish ancestry that we continuously see within, I would say, the Mormons. And then you do see some sort of support for, and you see it in Christian Zionists too. I'm not saying it's just Mormons, but you do see that kind of allegiance to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so, and I'm really glad
I don't know if that's just me noticing that right now, or if it is something.
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, it's really funny that you bring that up, because that's so to just literally, this is brand new research from today as I was preparing this timeline today. And it's really, really interesting that you mentioned that, because here's what's next. So what you see is, like, you see the King name, but then I actually ran into another name that was really interesting. And so I want to kind of I'm going to go a little bit backwards here. I'm going to skip past this and people will probably pause and want to read it, but I want to talk about something that happened in around 1915, 1916, 1917, because I've known about this for probably a year now. And today is the day that I really kind of I may have put the pieces together. Let's just use the may as a qualifier. But there's a man by the name of John Widtsoe. And John Widtsoe was a Mormon apostle who was married into the Brigham Young family and went back east to school, and then came back and was actually the president of the University of Utah before he became a Mormon apostle. And he wrote a book called In a Sunlit Land. And about a year ago, I was reading that book and I found this quote, and I'm just going to read it and then we're going to go backwards in time. So John A. Widtsoe testifies, he says, "It was actually shocking when I accidentally overheard two non-Mormon regents, among the most eminent men of the state, conversing upon this subject. Said one, 'We must take over the university and train the young people away from Mormonism.' 'Yes,' answered the other, 'you are right. That's our next job, to secure full control of the institution, secure a non-Mormon president and teachers, and educate the students away from Mormon beliefs. The state will then be ours.' For the moment, at least," says John Widtsoe, "these men forgot their oath of office as regents of the university." And then he asks, or was it just for the moment? And again, like, I think it's just so fascinating to go back and do this historical research and see Wilford Woodruff saying, we're going to build this even if it bursts the church. And then you see Widtsoe a couple decades later talking about these non-Mormon regents at the University of Utah literally conspiring to overthrow the university and take people away from Mormonism so that they can take over the state of Utah. Now, I didn't put it up on here, but I would encourage everybody to go look at how much of Utah is owned by the federal government. And you have to sort of look at it. And I think if you're going to look at it sort of clear-eyed, you have to recognize that if you look at what John Widtsoe says was they were planning on happening, if you look at it honestly, it did happen. Within a few years, Widtsoe is not the president, and they get a non-Mormon president. There's a huge thing that goes on right before Widtsoe comes, where some teachers really, the fight for academic freedom, quote unquote, really started at the University of Utah right around this time of 1915. And to me, at least, it appears that these non-Mormon regents were very, very successful at doing what they said they were going to do, or that John Widtsoe says that they were going to do. And what's interesting about this is that I've known that it was these two non-Mormon regents, but I'd never been able to sort of identify which regents it was. And I think that today I may have been able to find one of them. And the way that this works is that there was a group of Bambergers, right, that show up in Utah after this East Coast Capitol infusion. And just to give you an idea of their influence in the state during this time, I was able to pull a few links. And what you have is you have Ernest Bamberger, who's at the University of Utah on the Board of Regents in that year, like in that time frame that John Widtsoe was serving as the president of the university. You have Simon Bamberger, who became the first non-Mormon governor of Utah. And then you have Clarence Bamberger, who was part of Salt Lake City Rotary, all at the same time. Now, what really kind of opened my eyes, and this goes to the question that or the comment you were making, Lisa, excuse me, is that I just thought, you know, like, I really like etymology. I thought I would look and find out, like, well, where does that family name come from? And if you look, that Bamberger name is a German and Jewish Ashkenazic name. And it says, right, like, I mean, anybody can Google this, right? And it says it's a habitational name for someone from Bamberg in Bavaria, which we know is highly occult, right? Like a highly occult area, part of the world.
Very much so.
It says this surname is also found in France. And I mean, I'm going to be honest, and like, I'll tell you right now, like, the last thing I need is whatever that group is that owns all of our Congress, and every congressman is assigned a lobbyist, and like, and then if you say anything bad about Jews, they show up on, you know, and ruin your life. Like, the last thing I need in my life is to be labeled as an anti-Semite.
Right.
But the historical record shows very clearly that in Utah, the Bamberger family of German and Jewish extraction sets up shop in Utah right around the time that Skull and Bones shows up, right around the time that Rotary Club shows up, and they find themselves in positions of power very, very quickly, right? And so everybody can go to these links. I don't think we have all the time that we need to go and look at each of these individually, but for example, like the governor one, which I can't remember his name, Simon Bamberger, is buried in a Jewish cemetery, right? So I don't think that this is like an anglicized and,
right.
you know, this is, I think, probably straight from the area over into New York and then down into Utah, right? And so just to go to your points, it appears that this group of Ashkenazic Jews put down some pretty deep roots and find themselves in positions of power, influence, and gain very quickly in Utah. Once Utah opens themselves up to that influence because of their debt problems, right? Mm-hmm. So if you move forward just a little bit, so I mean, I think if we just let's go backwards really quickly. So 1911, you get Wesley King creating the Rotary Club, and you can see in the newspaper records that it's very successful. They pull in people very, very quickly. And by 1919, and this really starts, the conversation really starts in like 1916, and they start saying, well, look, we want to host Rotary Internationals, and it may not have been Rotary International that early on. I can't remember the year that it becomes Rotary International, but they say we want the major Rotary meeting to happen here in Salt Lake City. And sure enough, by 1919 or in 1919, that Rotary International meeting is in Salt Lake City, and you've got the Mormon prophet, George Albert Smith, attending that. And I've linked to where people can see that in the Archives West archive. So this record goes to a picture. I don't have access to the picture because I'm not part of the institution, but somebody could certainly go and grab this picture and see George Albert Smith at the Rotary International meeting in 1919. So within, you know, and I think it actually happens earlier than this, but within the first 8 years, you go from establishing the club to having the Mormon prophet hanging out at the biggest Rotary meeting of the year that's being hosted in Salt Lake City. And that's how fast Rotary International's influence took root there in Utah. And what I'm going to show you now moving forward is that literally every Mormon leader from George Albert Smith up through our current leader has definitely, like, you can find resources that talk about their involvement with or being awarded by or giving money to, and so on and so forth, to Rotary International. And so it's not something that was like a flash in the pan. This has now been going on for over 100 years of these two organizations influencing each other. Before I proceed, there's one thing that is, it's more, I doubt there are a lot of Mormons watching Occult Rejects, but if any of them are, there's one thing I want to point out, which is simply this, because I think that Mormons who are going to be intellectually honest with themselves need to ask themselves this question. So in Mormonism, we have what's called the Temple Recommend questions. So the temple is like our most holy structure. And in order to go to the temple, you have to complete a recommend interview. And it asks, I think it's like somewhere between 12 and 15 questions or something like that. And they change from time to time, but they change especially during, like, once Rotary gets its hooks into Mormonism. And as these guys sort of grow into power and influence, you see the temple recommend questions changing quite a bit. And probably the biggest one for me is simply this question, which is, do you support, affiliate with, or agree with any group or individual whose teachings or practices are contrary to or oppose those accepted by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? And what I'm going to propose here tonight is that pretty much everybody that we talk about moving forward, like logically and by necessity, was lying on their temple recommend interviews because they were affiliating with and supporting with individuals and groups that had teachings and practices that were contrary to or opposed to those accepted by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at the time. And we'll talk about that a little bit, but I just want to sort of throw that in here because I think just as we move forward, it's really important, especially for if anybody Mormon comes across this, to stop and really think about the pressure that most Mormons feel regarding getting a temple recommend, and then seeing the historical evidence that their leaders were just lying through their teeth, right, in order to get their own temple recommends, right? So let's go back down and let's start looking sort of at this chain of people. So not a Mormon leader, but definitely a very influential individual in Utah history is the Eckles family. And if you don't recognize that name, Mariner Eckles, you definitely are going to want to look it up. He's key to the Federal Reserve. And it turns out that Mariner Eckles, as you dig in and do the research, you'll find that Mariner was a charter member of the Logan Rotary Club. And right around that same time that they're doing the meeting in Salt Lake City, and I believe just prior to really the Federal Reserve becoming a thing, right? And so this Eckles family, if you go to Utah, you'll see the Eckles name everywhere, right? Like on all the buildings, because David Eckles really saved the church's hide, again, financially, when they were in a lot of trouble. He was an incredibly successful businessman. And you can find Mormon leaders begging David for money, even after he died. There's I think it is George Albert Smith, or it might be Heber J. Grant. I don't quite remember. But you can find a letter where even after Eckles dies, there's a letter from a Mormon leader saying, hey, I don't mean to bother you, but before he died, he promised us this amount of money. Would you guys mind sending that check over to us, basically, right? And so, but to understand sort of this influence of Rotary International and sort of the internationalization of the church, I think it's really important to understand that Mariner Eckles was a key player in Rotary there in Utah as early as 1919 as a charter member of the Logan Rotary Club. So as we sort of move forward, what you'll see is that one of the really interesting relationships that you'll see if you do this research is how much interest Rotary has in organizations like Boy Scouts of America, and how much interest both of those organizations have in boys, right? And so, like, to the point of like literal headlines talking about the Boys Committee of Rotary make plans for looking after the welfare of youth, right? And so, I mean, I don't think personally that this started off nefariously necessarily. I could be wrong about that, but what we do know is that, like, an organization like Boy Scouts of America that was deeply, deeply tied in with Rotary, especially in a state like Utah, obviously, you know, the Boy Scouts of America are embroiled in one of the biggest sexual abuse scandals of any organization in modern history. And I think the roots of that really start with this group of men who are Rotary International, and then on like the directors of Boy Scouts of America in Utah. And whether or not they had the best interests of boys to start out with or not, what we can say after watching 100 years of this go on is that whatever their intent was, they ended up doing a tremendous amount of harm to a generation of boys, because there's just abuse case after abuse case after abuse case in that organization of Boy Scouts of America. And in Utah, you really can't separate Rotary from Boy Scouts and anywhere that like Mormonism is really deeply entrenched, like Arizona, which we'll talk about here in a second, or Idaho or Utah. These organizations are just completely tied at the hip, and it's very, very clear in the newspaper archives how this is working, right? So David O. McKay in 1920 he's a future Mormon prophet, and there's a really great book called The Rise of Modern Mormonism, because at least in Mormon scholars' eyes, David O. McKay really represented sort of a sea change in the way that the church worked and ran itself. And so what you can see is very early on in David O. McKay's church career that he is dealing with Rotary. And you can see that in a journal entry where he talks about he and one other church leader are going to go on like a worldwide tour to go talk to people. And they leave on the 4th of December, 1920, accompanied by the good wishes of church leaders, family, and friends. They're on their way to Japan, traveling on the Empress of Japan, which is pretty nice, right? Again, like Mormon apostles versus ancient apostles. You've got ancient apostles being shipwrecked. You've got modern apostles on these amazing boats like the Empress of Japan, right? But President McKay was sick much of the time. In describing his seasickness, he wrote, "Goodbye last night's dinner. Goodbye yesterday's Rotary luncheon." So you can see that these apostles, and I don't know if David O. McKay was a junior apostle or a senior apostle at this time. They sort of break it into two. There's 12 of them, and the first 6 are considered senior apostles. The bottom 6 are considered junior apostles. And I don't know where David O. McKay was at this point in 1920, but you can see that church leaders are already on the Empress of Japan going to Rotary luncheons as they head out to, purportedly preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I'm not here to say that they didn't preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. They certainly were engaging in those behaviors too, which you can see in the historical record. But there's sort of this, not double life, but there's dual purpose to pretty much everything that they do moving forward. And they want the church to know about the part where they show up at the stake center and call a stake president. What they don't want you to really know about is how deep the influence of Rotary International is in church history. So another church leader that I found a picture of, a document of that relates to Rotary and how deeply entrenched it was in Mormon culture is Howard Hunter. Howard Hunter was president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for a very short time, I think about 18 months before he died. But I found an article that talks about how he was in scouting in Boy Scouts, and they would hold their court of honors at the Rotary clubhouse. And so again, you can just sort of see how these organizations are really just like church, Rotary, scouting. It's all the same thing basically to these guys as they're growing up in this generation. And so that's another Mormon prophet that we found a document on regarding Rotary and church involvement in Boy Scouts. Let me stop there again for just 1 second and let you ask any questions if you have any before I move forward.
No, one thing I do want to ask though, have you ever known anything with Hunter S. Thompson being involved with Mormons or anything like that?
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't heard that.
All right. It was the only reason I'm asking. It could just been like a random thing, but did I tell you about I don't know if I sent you the clip where I noticed that in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas they mentioned the Rotary Club.
You did send me that. Yeah.
I thought that was weird.
I've never seen anything with it relating to Hunter S. Thompson, but I mean, definitely if you look at people like Howard Hughes, like the Mormons were really Howard Hughes's handler, right? And they really isolated him to the point where like the word on the street was that this Mormon mafia had basically grabbed Howard Hughes and isolated him in and I believe it was Las Vegas actually, in a Las Vegas hotel where he owned like the entire floor of this hotel. And so like, it wouldn't shock me to find a tie between the LDS Church and Hunter S. Thompson on some level somewhere, especially because of the church's deep ties to like intelligence agencies and so on and so forth. So I can't say that I have found anything along those lines, but I can say that it wouldn't shock me at all to find a tie somewhere along the line if I were to dig in and just take a look at it, right? Now, I will say that with Hunter S. Thompson, he was really into drug culture and those kinds of things. And I think that the Mormons did try to sort of avoid that because of their sort of squeaky clean image. And so, but who knows? I think what I can say is that, like, as I've looked at basically every major quote unquote conspiracy theory over the last 100 years or more, like, you're going to find a prominent Mormon within 1 degree of separation from every major conspiracy theory, no matter where you look, whether it's Watergate, right? Whether it's Iran-Contra. Yeah. So just any of it. So like, it wouldn't shock me at all to find a Mormon connection there personally, but I haven't found one yet, I guess is my answer.
Gotcha. For people who have seen Fear and Loathing, or if you might see it again in the future, there is a part where I think it's when they're huffing the ether and they're about to walk into like the casino or whatever, and like they're having problems walking, and they mentioned something about like the angry Rotarians, and like because they call themselves, well, you knew that too, Rotarians. But you know what was interesting? What I found really interesting is that if you're watching it and you see the group of people that he's talking about, they actually have Shriner hats on. So I just find that interesting. Even, you know, is that like maybe they had no idea, but I'm like, that is interesting because I do think there is a Masonic connection somewhere too. Yeah. So I did find that interesting that they were wearing Shriner hats and he called them Rotarians.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, and look, I don't know a ton about this, but what I've heard from the people that have looked into this a little bit deeper is that like Rotary, Shriners, Lions, any of those groups, it's basically sort of the same game, just a different name, right? And so, but I do think that's it. Like, I mean, personally, I would have to imagine that was probably an editorial choice in the movie to have people with Shriners hats, but call them Rotarians, right? And there maybe is a deeper sort of message there that whoever produced that or directed it was trying to get across. It would be really interesting to ask, to reach out and ask, like, you know, I don't think it's errata. Let's just put it that way, right?
Then,
so it's also
real quick, if you don't mind. Just another thing I wanted to mention too. It's a shout out for JJ Vance. He had noticed. I don't know if it was Fletch or Fletch Lives, too. He had sent me some like clip from YouTube. Where in there, one of those movies, Chevy Chase is like talking to somebody, and he's like, "Yeah, I stopped down at the Rotary Club. There ain't nothing going on down there. Figured I'd come over here and see what's going on." And he was just like, "Yo, look at that like random like Rotary Club just like tossed in there."
Yeah.
And I was like,
Well, just wait because I'm going to do some movie trivia today that I found again, just like really fresh research from today.
All right, cool.
And so just hang on tight for just a couple minutes, and I'm going to show you this. It's probably going to blow your mind a little bit. It definitely did mine.
So I'll shut up and I'll let you go now.
You mentioned sort of the Masonic influence, and I just want to point out that like you're not the first person to think of that. As early as 1925, there were some Catholic priests that were really worried about Rotary as it spread internationally, and what they thought was its Masonic influence. And so this quote here says, so this is actually from a Rotary International link, which I have here, and everybody can go read this because Rotary actually talks about this very openly, this topic of Rotary and the church, and a man named James H.F. Roth. And the quote that I pulled out, it says, by some strange reasoning and manipulation of ideas, the Rotary will is equated to the Masonic symbol, the pyramid with the eye. And I'll be honest, I don't see it, but whatever. This French newspaper apparently somehow came up with the idea that the Rotary symbol had something to do with the pyramid in the eye. I personally think, I mean, the idea of a rotor is a really fascinating one, and we could talk about that if you want to, but like, I don't think personally that logo looks a ton like a pyramid with an eye, but maybe there's a way to permute it that makes it that way. Apparently some French people thought. They go on to say, Rotarians become synonymous with Freemasonry of the meetings and the way members are selected constitutes La Croix, further proof of the Masonic spirit. The principles of Rotary are, quote, empty, vague, inconsistent, and vulgar, which I would actually agree with. It says, a few years later, on April 19th, 1929, a book written by a Jesuit, and I'm going to totally butcher this name, but it's Felipe Alonso Barcena, was published in Spain. It contained a comprehensive analysis of Rotary, making reference to the contents of the statutes, the bylaws, and the code of ethics. According to the author of the book, it is clear that those writings prove without a doubt that Rotary members must be Freemasons. However, this is not the major sin of the organization. So I think the only point here I want to make is, and I'm going to drive this home here in a little bit with some other historical documents, but the idea that Rotary might have Masonic ties is not a modern idea necessarily. From its very inception, and especially as it began to spread around the world, this was a concern for, like, especially the Catholic Church, which to this day, if you are a Freemason, you will get excommunicated from the Catholic Church. The Mormons and the Masons had major problems springing out of Joseph Smith's time, setting up a lodge in Nauvoo, and some really crazy stuff that happened then. But eventually, and I think it was through Rotary, honestly, that the relationship between Mormons and Masons was really healed. And I'm going to show that with historical documents moving forward. But I just want to point out that it's not a conspiracy theory per se, it's certainly not a modern idea. The idea that there are Masonic influences behind Rotary is 100 years old at this point. Right?
I'm almost positive. Now I know.
So
real quick, if you don't mind, I'm almost positive. Not to get off
Not at all,
Rotary,
no.
but with the Lions Club, I know that guy who started that. He definitely was an ex-Mason. He even said it was for like Masons without the aprons. But I know there's like that one dude, King, with the Rotary Club. But I'm almost positive like the first 3 or 5 names as founders, like 2 of them were Masons anyway. You know what I'm saying? Like there was Masons, there was Masons in the original group of Rotary people. Even if that guy himself wasn't one, they were there in the inception or the beginning of it.
Yeah, well, and certainly in Salt Lake City, one of the really interesting things, if you go back into the newspaper archives, is that they spin it up in 1911 and they start dying in like 1940. And as you start seeing the obituaries, again, they're not trying to hide it. It's very clear. You'll see in the obituary, and I have an example of this, I think, on the timeline, where it just very openly says, so-and-so was a member of the Rotary Club and a Master Mason at Lodge number whatever. So, whether the founders were Masons, I can't speak to, but in Salt Lake and in Utah and in Logan, like certainly there was this mingling of Rotary and Masonry and Mormonism and Presbyterianism and so on and so forth. And I'm going to talk about what they call Rotarian theology, which is something that I learned about in the last couple of weeks that I think is going to be really interesting to you and your audience regarding, I think, how they see this, right? And so I think it's coming up here in just a couple events. So, but yeah, I don't think it would be hard to go back, and I'm sure you're probably right that probably several of the people who spun up Rotary likely had Masonic ties, right? So we're going to go back to sort of like Mormon leadership and Rotary. So Harold B. Lee is also a prophet of the church eventually. So one of the interesting things is Harold B. Lee has what I'm going to call like the Sacred Grove Part 2 experience. And for anybody, who knows anything about Mormon theology, Mormonism starts with Joseph Smith going into what they call the Sacred Grove and having the first vision. And so Harold B. Lee kind of echoes that experience, but instead of it being in a grove of trees in upstate New York, it happens in a place called Rotary Park in Salt Lake City. And so he just says, after that morning, I rode up in my car up to the head of City Creek Canyon into what was then called Rotary Park. And there, all by myself, I offered one of the most humble prayers of my life. And that really echoes like Joseph Smith. You can see him sort of trying to use the same language that Joseph used in his experience. He says, as I kneeled down, my petition was, what kind of an organization should be set up in order to accomplish what the presidency is assigned? And what he's talking about there is the welfare program of the church. So like helping people who need food or money during times of unemployment or other crisis. He says, there came to me on that glorious morning one of the most heavenly realizations of the power of the priesthood of God. It was as though something were saying to me, there is no new organization necessary to take care of the needs of this people. All that is necessary is to put the priesthood of God to work. There is nothing else that you need as a substitute. So this is a very, very Mormon story, right? It's a very, what we would call a faith-promoting story. But it's really, really interesting to me that it starts at a place called Rotary Park. And we now know that by this time, Rotary International and the priesthood of God, quote unquote, were inextricably linked up to each other for the last 20 years. And so the similarities between like Rotary humanitarian work and Mormon, like the systems that they put in place to take care of the needy, it's really fascinating to understand sort of what at least part of the driving force behind those programs really was. And it was this organization that's very much Rotarian in nature, right? So one interesting thing that I found was about Hotel Utah. Hotel Utah is probably one of, if not the most famous hotels in Salt Lake City. And it turns out that Hotel Utah was run by a Rotarian. He was a man, and I don't know how to pronounce his name, might be Mr. Reef. I'm not sure how to say that. Or Ralph, it looks like maybe, Ralph. And he came from New York and was a member of Rotary International. And then a little bit further down the line here, I'm going to show you what was going on at the Hotel Utah. But I threw this in here because what I want you to see, and what I want everybody to see, is that Rotary is really involved in all of the major things going on in Salt Lake City, including the hotels, including the newspapers, including the churches, everything, right? Commerce Club. They're deeply, deeply integrated into the Salt Lake community. In 1936, I have a document that shows that future LDS prophet Spencer W. Kimball was a district governor, and he was out in Arizona. And so you can see that it's not just in Utah that Rotary is getting its hooks into Mormonism. It's everywhere sort of in that Mormon corridor, which is going to be Idaho, Utah, parts of Nevada, and Arizona. And Spencer W. Kimball was a major Rotary guy. In fact, when he got called to full-time church service, you can find documents that say that his biggest regret was having to let go of some of his Rotary duties in order to do church duties, right? So Spencer W. Kimball was the prophet right around the time. So Spencer W. Kimball, I don't know, I think we talked about it a little bit in the last interview, but Spencer W. Kimball is the one who in 1977 was meeting with the CIA asset Khashoggi family, taking a break from a temple meeting to go meet with the Khashoggis, who were setting up, I think it was called the Triad Center in Salt Lake City. And he takes time out of his church duties to meet with the Khashoggi family. And so now you've got Kimball with Rotary, Mormon leadership, and CIA, ties all sort of rolled up into one life. And I think Kimball is a really fascinating character that probably deserves a little bit more scrutiny than I've been able to give him. So for other researchers, that's definitely a rich place to sort of dip in and see what you can find. One other person, again, just showing the influence sort of in like Salt Lake culture. This is a name that most Mormons wouldn't even recognize, but it's Piper. And Piper was a Rotary Club member, and he was one of the charter members of what they called the Orpheus Club, which was part of the Philharmonic Society. And he was also the manager and president of the Musical Arts Society. Now, to me, this is really important because all of my abuse research, almost every single time we get a case, you're going to find arts people involved in it. And so to see that this Piper fellow was spinning up clubs like the Orpheus Club, the Philharmonic Society, Musical Arts Society, and then also Rotary, really ties it into my abuse research, because I can't even think of a case where we look at somebody who has been abused that isn't somehow linked or tied to the Salt Lake City arts community. And obviously that doesn't mean that everybody in the Salt Lake arts community is an abuser, but it's certainly a place where we find a lot of abuse going on out there. And so we've now got that tie between the arts community and Rotary International. Another thing that I just threw in here to show was how Rotary was also tied in with the fraternities. So we talked about Skull and Bones earlier, and we talked about how they were there to help sort of ease tensions between different fraternities. And I think we may have talked about in my first interview that at the University of Utah, I've run all the data, and it's very clear that Sigma Chi and Pi Kappa Alpha had a power sharing agreement there at the University of Utah, because each of them got about 50% of the Skull and Bones initiative, or they each got equal amounts. And then the other fraternities sort of got the slim pickings, and they'd get 1 or 2 every year. But Sigma Chi and Pi Kappa Alpha, every single year and over a 60-year period, it ends up almost exactly 50-50 in terms of the number of Skull and Bones members that those two fraternities get. And so the path looks like, you start out as a young Mormon man and they start you in Boy Scouts. And depending on how you do there, then as you go to college, they'll get you into a fraternity. And then once you've got the fraternity, that puts you into that sort of cream of the crop where you can join something like Rotary Club as an influential part of the community. And then, of course, the sky's the limit there. And what you'll see with Mormons especially is that if you're really the cream of the crop, they'll send you out to Washington, D.C. And you end up being, an Eagle Scout / Rotary International member / Sigma Chi Pi Kappa Alpha Beta Epsilon member. And then you're in DC working with sort of the big guys of all these different organizations, right? But it's a pretty clear path forward for a Mormon young man, especially during these couple generations. And it's not at all hard to see once you look at the historical documents, and certainly not widely known in the church that that's sort of how it works. Okay, I think it's another good place to pause because I'm gonna pivot to sort of talking about Rotary International and the United Nations. So why don't I stop here and let you guys ask any questions that you have, if you have any at this point.
I have two, so I don't know if you want to go, Nick, or
No, you go.
So I had looked into a couple of things because you had mentioned Boy Scouts last time, and I kind of briefly looked up Boy Scouts and affiliations with Mormonism. What is the difference between, and maybe you could clarify for me because I didn't really understand it, MIA Scouts versus the Boy Scouts? Is that like an offshoot of the Boy Scouts, or did MIA morph into Boy Scouts, or is that a sect of Boy Scouts that is exclusive to Mormons?
That's a great question. And so I'm not an expert on this, but I think I can answer it satisfactorily for tonight's purposes. So MIA is the church's, what they call the Mutual Improvement Association. And Mutual is the program for the youth in the church. And so one of the things that's really interesting that you see is there's sort of this tension where the church wants to maintain its autonomy. And so it'll set up something that's very Rotarian, right? And like this MIA organization is, and I'll show you this in the timeline a little bit later because I think it's called Rotaract, which is sort of Rotary International's youth organization. And I would just equate MIA with the Rotaract group, right? And so you can sort of see this tension between like Mormon aristocracy who want to be a part of the world. And so they'll join organizations like Rotary, but then sort of the general church membership, the programming that you grew up with is that you're a peculiar people and you want to be in the world, but not of the world. And so church leaders are forced to create these organizations or partner with organizations that are very worldly in a sense, but then they try to put a Mormon spin on them. And I would consider MIA sort of that sort of thing. Like we talked about the boys, what was it called up top? It was like how Rotary had specific parts of their organization focused strictly on helping boys. MIA was the church's effort to strictly help the youth, boys, young men, what they call young men and young women. And over history, what you'll see is the church gets involved with the MIA program, and then it morphs into something else. And then they get involved really heavily with scouting. And scouting becomes a part of that, what they call the mutual program. And for the boys, scouting almost becomes mutual exclusively, right? And then, of course, not very long ago, probably within the last 5 years, the church separated itself from Boy Scouts because of the sex scandal. And now they have another program that's very similar to that MIA program where the youth are supposed to be sort of planning their own activities, but it's very Rotarian in the sense of just supporting the youth and helping them develop. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It totally does. Yeah, because now I can see where the tie-in is. My second question, it pivots a little bit away, and this is more of a general question, because as you're talking about Rotary International, the thing that keeps popping in my head, Rotary International, is all of their affiliations with third world countries. And you see this huge presence, well, obviously international, right? But you see this huge presence in countries that are not only underdeveloped and third world, but extremely impoverished. And to me, it always was like, why does Rotary International and I don't know if this is true for Mormonism, go into some of these very impoverished countries. It's almost synonymous to what Spanish Catholicism had done back, during the colonial
Absolutely.
period. Is that the goal of, and this is of course a more general question, is that the goal of Mormonism, to kind of mimic what the Catholic colonialism did, to kind of spread the word and kind of make more of themselves the way Spanish Catholicism did in Latin America? And is that also somewhat of a blueprint that Mormonism is following in Latin America?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, obviously this is a little bit of a matter of opinion, right? And so I'll just express my opinion about it, but I do think it's backed by quite a bit of historical evidence. And so if you want to look into sort of LDS involvement in like third world countries, a great place to start is in LDS philanthropies. And that's literally like part of the Mormon business empire is LDS philanthropy. And I actually, for a very, it was the shortest job I ever had, but at Brigham Young University, they had, and I don't know if this is still there, but they have an office where if you're a student, you can go and you can get a job at LDS philanthropy. And it's basically calling all the rich Mormons and asking them to donate money for church purposes, including these third world programs. And I have a document down below where I'm going to show just how intertwined this is. But I think what you're seeing here, in my opinion, is really sort of a desperation in Mormon leadership. Okay. And you have to understand it's really hard, I think, for people who had never been Mormons and haven't looked at it carefully. But Mormons truly believe that they are the one true religion that's meant to fill the earth. And if in 1942, the church is still very small, right? Even up through the 1980s, the church is very small. And Spencer W. Kimball, who we just talked about, is getting very frustrated with the fact that the church isn't growing. And I think the decision, based on what I've researched, that the church leadership made is, in order for the church to grow, we need to be more like the Catholics. In order to grow more quickly, we need to be more like the world. We need to get ourselves involved in organizations like Rotary International. And then eventually what you're going to see is organizations like Red Cross, organizations like the United Nations, partnering with groups like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I think that this idea of a peculiar people really fell out of favor with Mormon leadership right around this time of the 1940s. And they decided, look, we're going to go all in and we're just going to integrate into the larger society that we're a part of. And we're going to have faith that if we do that, that the church will grow the way that we anticipate that it needs to, including getting our toe in, because I mean, preaching the gospel to all the world is one of the major missions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the easiest way to get into a country is to do philanthropic work first so that you can build goodwill and then ask for permission to preach the gospel.
And via Rotary International.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's especially now after these, and again, I hope nobody thinks that I've looked at this for the last 10 years and I'm some expert. I'm a month into it, right?
Yeah.
It's so unbelievably obvious to me that they chose Rotary International or Rotary International chose them. And I think that's a really interesting question that people need to look at. And that goes back to, I think I skipped it, but when you look at what was happening with the unease with the Catholic Church and Rotary International, what Rotary International did is identify a man who was in the quote unquote diplomatic service, which, look, he may have just been a diplomat, but we know that the CIA uses diplomatic service as a cover, right?
Right. And
it just so happens that this Catholic Rotarian is in all the same countries of all the places where I found Mormon CIA, and it's South American countries like Uruguay, right? And Peru. And this guy went around and he was Knights of Columbus, which is like the Catholics. It's I don't know, you might be able to compare it to I think Ezra Taft Benson looked at the John Birch Society sort of as the same way that the Catholics look at the Knights of Columbus, which I think the Catholics call the Knights of Columbus the strong right arm of the church, right? Which has symbolism and all that kind of thing. And so I think that to me, it looks like Rotary chose Mormons, and then Mormons took the bait. That's the way. As a former Mormon, that's how I would put it. Because as a former Mormon, I would say the church was charged by the Lord to remove itself from the world. But when Rotary International came knocking, and then the CIA came knocking, and then Lockheed Martin came knocking, it was in order to fulfill their goal of preaching the gospel to the world, they were getting more and more desperate because just preaching the gospel wasn't working. They needed other ways to access countries, and Rotary International presented an amazing opportunity to access other countries through philanthropic work. And the CIA and Lockheed Martin in the military industrial complex certainly offered tremendous opportunities to enter into countries as communist governments were toppled and so on and so forth. Right.
That totally makes sense. That totally answers my question. Thank you. Yeah,
no problem. Anything else?
No.
Okay. So let's talk about United Nations and Rotary International. So it definitely wouldn't be fair to say that like Rotary started with the purpose of like international whatever, but like what's abundantly clear from the historical record is that Rotary International was a driving force behind the United Nations, and they're very open about it. And so if you go to this link that I have linked in my timeline, you'll find a page where they talk about the first time that the term United Nations was used, according to them, was in 1942. And so I went and found that declaration, and it was called the Declaration by the United Nations. Now, this isn't the United Nations that you're thinking of. This is literally sort of the first time that anybody uses it, but it's really interesting to look at the countries that were involved here. And so I'm just going to read this really quickly. This was on January 1st, 1942, which is, right around World War II time, right? It says, a joint declaration by the United States, the United Kingdom, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, China, Australia, Belgium, Canada, Costa Rica, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Greece, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, India, Luxembourg, Netherlands, New Zealand, Nicaragua, Norway, Panama, Poland, South Africa, and Yugoslavia. It says the government signatory hereto, having subscribed to a common program of purposes and principles embodied in the joint declaration of the President of the United States of America and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, dated August 14th, 1941, known as the Atlantic Charter, being convinced that complete victory over their enemies is essential to defend life, liberty, independence, and religious freedom, and to preserve human rights and justices in their own lands as well as in other lands, and that they are now engaged in a common struggle against savage and brutal forces seeking to subjugate the world, declare each government pledges itself to employ its full resources, military or economic, against those members of the tripartite pact and its adherents with which such government is at war. Each government pledges itself to cooperate with the government signatory hereto and not to make a separate armistice or peace with the enemies. The foregoing declaration may be adhered to by other nations which are, or which may be, rendering material assistance and contributions in the struggle for victory over Hitlerism. Now, look, I think this is a deep, deep topic, and I have definitely not had enough time to get into this. And so, I'm just going to toss this over the fence, and I get blamed for being a conspiracy theorist by all kinds of people all the time. And this is this is the conspiracy theory, guys. If you're dealing with Masonic influence in organizations, a declaration like this can be seen by some people as a group of people fighting against Hitlerism. But if you go back and look at, again, the influence of Utah and Rotary International and who was doing that, and you know that they're all in Freemason circles, in Freemason organizations, what I really see is, so I like to say it this way. You'll get your QAnon people and they'll be like, it's black hats versus white hats. And of course, that's Western, you got your cowboy in your white hat and you got your cowboy in your black hat. I prefer to think of it this way. What I see when I see something like the Declaration by the United Nations is something more along the lines of black squares and white squares. And this is especially important in the Mormon Church when you realize that the Mormon Church and its involvement in the railroads was really through Averell Harriman. And you see that that's the Bush family, and you know that the Bushes were funding both sides of the war. And to me, it looks more like a game that they're playing, putting out these declarations saying that they're fighting each other, when really they're just on the same board, and the goal is really to extract the resources of the populace so that they can continue to enrich themselves through endless war and never-ending conflict. So, whatever. Somebody way smarter than me is going to have to come along and figure that out. But I just kind of want to throw it out there that this declaration by the United Nations immediately gets picked up by Rotary International, and they write a document as soon as the Dumbarton Oaks conference, which is where the United Nations sort of comes into existence, and they immediately send out a missive to all of their clubs called "What Can Rotarians Do Following Dumbarton Oaks?" And what you can see from these documents is that it appears to me, at least, that Rotary was like waiting in the wings. Whoops, sorry about that. Was waiting in the wings and a part of this United Nations plan from the very, very beginning. So what you have here on the left is a document from the United States Secretary of State inviting Rotary International to the first United Nations, to be part of the U.S. delegation in the San Francisco United Nations Conference. On the right, you have that document of what can Rotarians do to follow Dumbarton Oaks, okay? So to me, like, these things take time normally, right? But in this case, they start talking about it, and within months, Rotary International is already a major part of the United Nations, and they're very proud of it. And they're sending out across the world, how can we support this United Nations declaration? So it appears coordinated to me, right? So the thing that's really important for Mormons to understand is that in the same year that this is all happening, this is when so Russell M. Nelson in his autobiography calls his father daddy, even though he's like 55 years old, which like some psychiatrist is going to have to deal with that, or psychologist or whatever. But so what you'll learn is that Daddy Nelson becomes the president of the Salt Lake City Rotary Club in 1943. So right at this exact time when they're making this play to do the United Nations stuff and Rotary International is full throat behind it, is when Russell M. Nelson's father becomes the president of the Salt Lake City Rotary Club. So this brings up some really interesting questions, I think, personally, because historically, we find information about Russell M. Nelson pre-1943. There's really not much to find. There's some high school photos, and then, of course, he wrote his autobiography when he was like 50 years old, and so there's a lot of information there that he wrote about himself. But as soon as his dad becomes president of Rotary Club, Russell M. Nelson becomes the big man on campus at the University of Utah, and you can hardly turn the yearbook page without seeing a picture of Russell M. Nelson, and you can hardly find a newspaper article in those last couple of years that he's at the University of Utah in which he and his wife, his to-be wife, Dancel White, aren't being mentioned. So he goes from zero to hero almost overnight, and it really appears to me it's directly correlated to his father becoming president of Salt Lake City Rotary Club at the same time that the United Nations and Rotary International are sort of kicking things into gear in terms of this international vision of one world government, and I think personally one world religion, right? And so on and so forth. So from the Mormon perspective, you've got a really interesting situation where you've got a skull and bones prophet becoming the big man on campus at the same time that the internationalization of the political community is going on. And they really kind of need somebody in Utah to put into a position of power inside the church where they can advance that agenda. And by no means do I think that Russell M. Nelson knew that he was a pawn in this game, but I think it's a legitimate conversation to have of whether Russell M. Nelson is more a pawn in the game than anything else, and simply a person being used by his father to gain access to sort of complete this 1915 conspiracy to take somebody who's purportedly a Mormon, but has really been educated away from most of the major Mormon beliefs, and put him into a position of power in the church where eventually he might be able to help bring about the goals of Rotary and the United Nations. And I think the historical record almost forces this conversation for people with intellectual honesty, right? And I know that's really not the topic for tonight, but I think it's an important conversation for Mormons to look at, and we'll see why here in a little bit. A couple other people that, like Mormons are going to know, like Ezra Taft Benson was a Mormon prophet. He was the Secretary of Agriculture for Eisenhower. He had a long writing campaign with the head of the FBI that was released through a FOIA request. So he's talking to the Rotary Club in 1945. And now here's our little, this is our intermission. We're like halfway. And this is our intermission where we're going to do some fun, like movie trivia. And like, it's really weird. It kind of freaked me out when I found it today. So the United Nations conference happened at a place called Dumbarton Oaks. And as I was doing that research, I came across this information about Dumbarton Oaks, and they have an art gallery in there. And in that art gallery at Dumbarton Oaks, they have what's called the Aztec birthing figure. And you can see this statue here. And purportedly, it's a statue of a woman giving birth. You can see the kid down here, right? Now, if you read this, here's what it says. The Dumbarton Oaks birthing figure is striking, powerful, and entirely unparalleled. This Aztec-style sculpture of a woman giving birth conveys well the agony and ecstasy of childbirth. It is expertly carved in a hard speckled stone called apelite and has long impressed viewers, including artists, scholars, and prominent collectors of pre-Columbian art. Its unique iconography and carving have also sparked a lively debate about its origins and authenticity. First mentioned in 1899 publication by the French anthropologist E.T. Hamy, the sculpture has been compared to a representation of the goddess, who knows how you say that, in the act of childbirth featured in the Codex Borbonicus. So over here is the picture that they think that this statue came from. Now listen, this goddess, whose name translates as eater of filth, was associated with sexuality and the purification of sins. In the codices, she wears a large cotton headdress and crescent-shaped ornaments on her nose and or clothing. Her mouth is blackened with filth. The birthing figure sculpture is unusual in that it features none of whoever's usual attributes. The figure is naked and unadorned, unlike any other carving of an Aztec deity. Wink, wink. Since the 1960s, scholars have pointed to other unusual features, such as the figure's sharp edges and impeccably straight hair. Some have suggested that the carving might not be the work of Aztec carvers. A 2002 examination of the piece under scanning electron microscope confirmed that much of the carving was done using modern rotary tools. It appears that the Dumbarton Oaks birthing figure was carved, or perhaps recarved, during the 19th century. Now, it gets even weirder because, have you guys seen Indiana Jones?
Yeah. Oh.
So I don't remember. I'm not much of a movie guy, but I think it's India. It's not the Temple of Doom. What's the original one? But do you guys know that iconic scene in Indiana Jones where Indy there's an altar and there's an idol and he swaps it out for a bag of money?
Yeah. I know what you're talking about. You know, like a bag of like dust or some shit, right? Or like sand.
So I didn't add it to my stuff, but online, what people are saying is that idol is a representation of the Aztec birthing figure held at Dumbarton Oaks and then put out there by Hollywood in the Indiana Jones movies, right? Now, I can't think of a much better way to symbolize what these United Nations people were trying to do, to birth a new world order, than to create an Aztec birthing figure and store it at Dumbarton Oaks in the museum, right? And so we know that the Masons and we know that the fraternities, we know Skull and Bones, we know all these occult organizations love to use symbolism. And so there is this conspiracy theory out there that I thought I would just toss in here tonight regarding Dumbarton Oaks, the Aztec birthing figure, and Indiana Jones and the idol that's there, and sort of how it symbolizes what these world leaders were trying to do is to cleanse the sins of the world and birth a new world order, right? So I'll let people do with that whatever the heck they want to. I thought it was somewhat entertaining. So
I will say one thing. There is a very important central deity in Aztec, and in Nahuatl, I think it's, I'm not even going to pronounce it, something with a T, and that deity was covered in soot, and especially the mouth area. But it was high priest, extreme rituals and stuff like that. So you mentioning the soot and then Aztec, I'm like, I remember that because when we covered Our Lady of Guadalupe, we talked a little bit about some of the deities, and that was a very central figure in Aztec belief system. So it's interesting.
Sure. I mean, and that symbolism is biblical as well, right? I mean, you have Isaiah talking about having his lips burned with a hot coal because his mouth was filthy, right? Mm-hmm. And so you've got this, and I'm sure you guys talk about this all the time, I would imagine, on your show, which is just symbolism around the world is sort of uniform, right?
Right.
And so for this to show up at Dumbarton Oaks, the birthplace of the United Nations, I think it's just something worth noting, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Something else, and again, just to get into other symbolism, as you look again, if we go back to Rotarians and Mormons, what I found is, again, a reference from President McKay, David O. McKay, who's now the president. So in 1920, he's talking about Rotary lunches. In 1955, he's talking about going out to Los Angeles where they're building a temple. And he says that he says, it was understood by the brethren in Los Angeles that I, President McKay, was anxious that the story of Solomon's temple be told at the baptismal font, meaning the baptismal font of the LDS temple. And at that time, I said the brethren in Salt Lake would write the script. So this shows the sincerity of Mormon leadership. I mean, they really do believe that their temples are like the descendant of Solomon's temple, right? I mean, and if you go back into Mormon history, you'll see Joseph Smith, when he starts up the Masonic Lodge in Nauvoo, and he takes the Freemason rites, and then he turns it into the temple endowment. He talks about it as though it was what he calls the apostate endowment, and that he's restoring the truths from Solomon's temple by stealing the Freemasonry rites and then purifying them or whatever in LDS temple worship, right? And you can see all the way up through 1955 this idea that the president of the church has, that he wants to make sure that as he's being feted by these Beverly Hills jet set folks in Los Angeles, that as they take them through the temple on the VIP tour, he definitely wants to make sure that they all know that we believe that our baptistry goes all the way back to Solomon's temple, right? So it's really old. Like, I mean, and they're very sincere about this. And I think it's really important that people understand that there's a lot of people I talk to they think that these guys are like in dark rooms conspiring. And I don't think that's it at all. I think they're very sincere, and I think they honestly believe in these things. But the question is it based in reality, right? And everybody has to decide for themselves whether the LDS temple really goes back to Solomon's temple, and whether or not the LDS endowment is a restoration of the rites being done in Solomon's temple. But I think that good scholarship has shown that to not be the case, in my opinion on that, right? So this is just another piece of this, because it just shows a lot of names that Mormons would recognize. So they're out in Los Angeles, and it talks about how they go to the Chamber of Commerce, and it's people like J. Reuben Clark Jr., Joseph Fielding Smith, who was a Mormon prophet, Harold B. Lee, which was a prophet, Ezra Taft Benson, who was a prophet, Henry Moyle, Delbert Stapley, Marion G. Romney, LeGrand Richards. And then it talks about another group that went to the Rotary Club, and it's Stephen L. Richards, Spencer W. Kimball, Mark E. Peterson, Adam S. Benyon, Richard L. Evans, and Elder George Q. Morris were likewise entertained by the Rotary Club at the Statler Hotel, right? So just major mingling between Mormons and Rotarians out in places like Los Angeles. Now, here's where we get the confirmation that Rotarians, at the very least, are very open to having Masons as part of their organization. So this is a Salt Lake or a Logan, I can't remember. Let's take a look. Rotary member who's not a member of the Mormon Church, but he was an obstetrician who was a member of the Logan Rotary Club and also of the Masonic Lodge and the Logan Presbyterian Church. And for me, this year is really interesting, because one of the things that I was researching is how things have shifted in terms of how the church defines apostasy and those temple recommend questions. And it was right around this time. So there was a prohibition on Mormons affiliating with and supporting Masons. But right around this time, they changed their policy in what's called the General Handbook of Instructions. And they say, hey, it's okay to hang out with people from secret societies now. And so this piece of historical evidence is really, really interesting, because clearly they know that they're answering that question inappropriately. And instead of changing their lives to like hew to what would be considered traditional Mormon beliefs, they go about, now that they're in positions of power, changing worthiness questions on temple recommend interviews so that they can answer those questions without feeling guilt when they lay their head down on a pillow at night. Because in Rotary Club, they're affiliating with these groups of people that historically the Mormon Church would say you definitely shouldn't be, and there's lots of documents that show this, like official church policy to not be involved with groups like these kinds of groups, right? So by 1966, you have your Mormon apostle who becomes the president of Rotary International, and they sort of get their turn, right? Like if you look at Rotary International's official explanation of why it's called Rotary, they say it's because they go from location to location to have their meetings. I mean, that's not true at all in Salt Lake City. Most of those meetings happen at the Hotel Utah. But I think what is happening is that you've got Presbyterians, Catholics, Mormons, whoever, and what they're doing is they're sharing power from year to year through the presidency of that organization. And in 1966, it's the Mormons' turn to have the power through Rotary International, through Mormon apostle, and I can't remember his name right now, his full name, but it was Evans, right? And so this picture is really interesting to me because on the left here, you have Gordon B. Hinckley, who ends up running the propaganda arm and the intelligence arm of the Mormon Church, and that's per his own bodyguard. You've got Elder Evans, who ran one of the most popular radio broadcasts in the history of broadcasting out of the Salt Lake Tabernacle for years and years and years. And then you've got J. Reuben Clark over here, who was like a counselor in the first presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So it's a very interesting picture to me because it sort of shows that power structure. And as I'm going to show later, Gordon B. Hinckley was also part of Rotary, although it appears to me that J. Reuben Clark was actually against the United Nations and what it stood for, interestingly. This is just to show sort of what you were asking, Lisa, which is about that MIA organization in Boy Scouts. In 1968, Rotary International forms Rotaract youth clubs. And I would highly encourage anybody interested in this to go to this link and look at the picture that is there, because basically it's a social organizing club to exert political influence for Rotary International and United Nations missions and goals. And so they start rolling the youth into it, right, on a much more organized level in 1968. Another name that Mormons would recognize is Leonard Arrington. Leonard Arrington was the church historian who read his scriptures once and decided that he didn't like what they had to say and decided that he was going to become the church historian and rewrite church history. It turns out that he was a member of the Logan Rotary Club. And then something really fascinating happens. And in 1976, the sole nominee for the Rotary International president was a man by the name of Dr. Wolfgang Wick. And it turns out that he has to step down because when they go to look at who he was actually a Nazi SS trooper. And so it's sort of a scandal in Rotary International, and he has to step aside. But they were months away from choosing a Nazi SS trooper as Rotary International president 10 years after a Mormon apostle was the president of Rotary International. Right?
Wasn't there like a shift in that during the Third Reich, they were preventing Nazis from joining Rotary Club? And then somehow, some way after that, the Nazis were now being like either trying to infiltrate or they were being allowed or something like that. But there was a total flip within less than 10 years.
Well, certainly within U.S. intelligence, I mean, there's a lot of documents that have been put out into the public sphere that show that a lot of Nazi influence came across into the United States through like Operation Paperclip and so on and so forth. And so I don't know about the first part of your question, Lisa. I'm just not an expert in that area. But certainly and again, this gets called conspiracy theory, but it's really in the historical record at this point, if you go to the CIA reading room, of a heavy Nazi scientist, especially influence, coming across from Germany into the United States and being utilized for all kinds of different things, right? Things that I would consider very problematic for a church like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that's it gets a little bit theological at that point. But let's just say that basically, like the gospel of Jesus Christ as taught by the Mormon church is all about mankind's agency, his ability to make choices and prove during his life that he'll choose to follow God. Whereas the CIA's mission really seemed to be focused on taking away man's agency through things like MK Ultra, right? And toppling governments, not allowing people to choose their own form of government, and so on and so forth. And so for the Mormon church to formally endorse the mission of the CIA in 1984 is extremely problematic for a former member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints like me, because I have a very deeply rooted belief that we should all have the ability to make our own choices while we're here on this earth, to prove to our God whom it is that we want to serve and how it is that we want to serve them. And so I'll leave it at that, because we're not here for a sermon, right? Yeah. But like, just on a very pragmatic level, the fact that the church is involved with organizations like Rotary International, United Nations, and the CIA, which to me all very clearly are working to take away mankind's ability to choose their own future, it's about as profound of a problem as I could experience as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints personally. Gotcha. And it really is what led me out of the church, I think, as I continued to question the motives and the actions of the leaders of the church. At the time, I had no idea about Rotary, but I did know about CIA and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it just seemed like both Nazis and Jews were trying to gain access, or at least like top tier access of Rotary. It's what it seemed like to me in the 40s. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair, right? Mm-hmm. So we're going to loop back. I mentioned that most of the Rotary International meetings happened at the Hotel Utah. And I also mentioned that the Hotel Utah is sort of a gemstone in Salt Lake City. Like a lot of Mormons have their wedding receptions, like especially like Mormon aristocrats have their weddings or wedding receptions at Hotel Utah. So I had heard a rumor about this a long time ago, and I never followed up on it until today, but I had heard that Hotel Utah has sort of its seedy side, and I found some confirmation of that today. There was a woman who used to work for the Salt Lake Police Department, and she wrote a story called Ducky, the true story of a decoy prostitute. And in her story, she talks about this. She says, a couple of years earlier, one of our decoy prostitutes had arrested Congressman Alan Howe for soliciting sex. He demanded a fellow congressman be expelled for a sexual escapade. After the arrest, the same man called for Howe to step down. He tried to deny the charges, but the decoy had every word on tape. Maybe I would become as famous as she had been, my name in the newspapers, because this whole story is about how she gets sucked into a task force to pose as a prostitute and go to the Hotel Utah and perform sex acts on prominent Salt Lake individuals. Well, who's meeting at the Hotel Utah? It's the Rotarians that are meeting at the Hotel Utah, right? So I don't have any direct evidence that the Hotel Utah was being used by Rotarians to engage prostitutes and do whatever else it is that Rotarians do on their free time. But I do think it's interesting that there's this correlation between the Hotel Utah being used as the place where Rotary International is meeting, and also the place where Salt Lake City Police knows to send their decoy prostitutes to if they want to catch congressmen in the act of soliciting sex, right?
That is interesting.
So I dropped this in 1980. I actually don't know where this goes on the timeline. I'm not sure when President Gordon B. Hinckley got involved in Rotary, but when he died, it was clear that he had been a member of Rotary and involved with Rotary for forever and ever. So I just dropped it into 1980 because that's sort of the middle of his time in church leadership. And so, but what you can see here is you end up with people saying things like this. As a tribute to President Gordon B. Hinckley when he died, it says, His Excellency, the Prophet, Gordon B. Hinckley. And that may not sound weird to a non-Mormon, but to a Mormon, that's a very weird thing to say. Like, we are not supposed to be referring to our prophets as His Excellency. They're not royalty, right? Like, they don't deserve titles or honorifics. They're supposed to be humble servants of God. But by the time that Gordon B. Hinckley has done whatever it is that he's done with Rotary, which is give them a bunch of money and receive a bunch of awards from them, people in Rotary see Mormons as, and they give them these honorific titles like His Excellency the Prophet, Gordon B. Hinckley. And you see this perpetuate down from Gordon B. Hinckley's time to where if you were to watch a Mormon General Conference, one of the things that you'll see Mormons doing now is they'll say things like, our beloved prophet, Russell M. Nelson, right? And it's all very gooey and icky and yucky if you know what a prophet's supposed to be and how he's supposed to be referred to. But they've gotten really used to this because of their involvement and because they've really at this point become like the darlings of organizations like Rotary and CIA and the military industrial complex. And they like it. They like being driven around in black limousines, which you can read about in Spencer W. Kimball's journals. They like being called His Excellency. They like being on like the best flights, and they like being on the boards of directors. Like their strategy has worked out very well for them. And not only that, but there's really, again, if you want to go back to the sugar analogy here, they started a sugar company and they got ingrained in the world. And then the thing that I think was really dangerous is the church was actually growing very, very quickly starting around this 1980 period. And so I'm sure from their perspective, it looked like everything was working exactly the way that they thought it should. And they probably saw it as divine approval for the choices that they had made, right? And like, who wouldn't like that? Your church is growing, your coffers are swelling, your membership is growing, you have become a part of the club. People are calling you His Excellency and sending cars to pick you up to be interviewed by Mike Wallace and Larry King. I mean, it's a pretty good life for a Mormon leader around this time. And so it's a pretty dangerous drug, right? And I think they fell for it. I think they loved it. I think they thought that they had done exactly what they were supposed to, and they were being rewarded by God for following His instructions. I would disagree with that assessment of things, but I can completely see why they would think that they were on the right track, right? And that they had made the right choices leading up to this. All right, why don't I stop here for one more second and see if you guys have any other questions? I think this is a fairly natural stopping point.
No, I'm good, really. Like again, like
Okay.
this is a lot of this is all like new to me. I wouldn't, don't even know where to go from here. I'm just following you.
So we'll just keep plowing forward then. So I want to talk about Rotary Club theology. So this is actually a term that you can find. You can Google Rotary Club theology, and you'll see a lot of people who talk bad about it, and then you'll see some people who support it. And here's what I really think it boils down to. I think that Rotary Club theology is basically the idea that we can be religious people who don't focus on doctrinal differences and pass power around in order to do good in the world by simply rotating power from year to year through that position of president of Rotary International. And so it's almost like a United Nations of religions. And what you'll see if you go out and search this topic is you'll see people saying things like, look, if you're a Catholic, you'll be a better Catholic by being a member of Rotary. If you're a Buddhist, you'll be a better Buddhist by being a part of Rotary. And so it's the secularization of religious beliefs by men who don't necessarily believe their religion, but like the perks of their religion, but also want to be successful in the world. Another way of saying that is it's a group of men who really want to serve two masters, right? And any Mormon listening to that, that's going to be a huge dog whistle to them, and they're going to be very mad at me. But I would propose that what you have in these generations of church leaders are men who desperately wanted to serve two masters and were quite successful at it for a very long time, up until the present, right? So a really perfect example of this is an organization that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints started in 2011. And this organization is called JustServe. And what JustServe is, if you look at it, is it's really a ripoff of the Rotary Club idea of service. And I'm going to show you who's on this board of JustServe, and I think it's going to blow your minds. But in terms of Mormon influence on JustServe, it's really, really important to understand that it was started by two guys, one named M. Russell Ballard and one guy named Richard J. Maines. Now, this is a little bit of a new subject for me as well, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I'm going to throw it out there because I know there are researchers who are interested in this topic. So Elder Ballard is proven to be like Lynn Packer, who is one of the best investigative reporters of a generation, calls M. Russell Ballard Utah's flim-flam man. And Ballard got investigated and found guilty by the SEC in multiple investigations, but he's a descendant of Joseph Smith, a direct descendant, of Joseph's brother Hiram. And so he's Mormon royalty because he's tied directly back to Mormonism's origins. But if you look at his life, it's just perpetual failing upwards. And to make it worse, he's deeply, deeply involved with many of the people that we know were involved in abuse situations in like Mount Olympus, Utah, which is it's just a fascinating study in psychology that a group of Mormon leaders would build a town in Utah and name it after the home of the Greek gods. And M. Russell Ballard was the bishop of one of the original wards in that Mount Olympus area where there was a lot of abuse happening at Skyline High School and East High School. So not a good guy, in my opinion. Now, just for full disclosure, M. Russell Ballard is a part of my excommunication story because when I found out and when I kind of caught on to the secret society influence in the church leadership, M. Russell Ballard was the one that responded to my letter where I basically said, look, just a heads up, it looks to me like you guys have been infiltrated by secret society members. And I knew that he was one of them, but he's the one that wrote me back and said, we think that your line of reasoning or your way of thinking is going to lead you into apostasy. So if people want to call this sour grapes, they're more than welcome to call it sour grapes. I would just encourage everybody to take a really, really close look at M. Russell Ballard's life. And I think there's not really a lot of leeway to call M. Russell Ballard a true disciple of Jesus Christ when you look at his life. That's just my opinion. Richard Maines is a new name to me today, but he's a fascinating one because he's out in Maricopa County. And if I'm scared of getting labeled an anti-Semite, I'm even more scared of taking on Maricopa County. Because every time I touch Maricopa County in my research, I start getting people emailing me and saying, you better be really careful because if you start talking about Maricopa County, something really bad could happen. So I'm not going to talk about it too much, except to say that there are some really interesting documents in the Maricopa County Recorder's Office about Richard J. Maines and some real estate transactions that were going on with him and his wife, Nancy. And then there's an even more interesting story about Richard Maines in Maricopa County because he and a buddy had founded a company based out of Florida, of all places, and it was about Antwerp diamonds. And that company ended up getting shut down for dishonest business practices. And you can find, like I have a tab up here that nobody can see, but you can find the business records where you can see that it was involuntarily shut down at the same time that Richard Maines is doing all kinds of weird real estate things in Maricopa County. And I mean, I will just say this, like, I'm not so scared like that. I'm not willing to say that Maricopa County appears to me to be like one of the most corrupt counties in the entire United States, all the way across the board. And so like, for those who are interested in this topic, I imagine you're going to find a heavy Rotary influence. There's certainly a tremendous Mormon influence. And one of the interesting things about Maricopa County is the insurance industry influence and how Mormons play into that. And then what I found as I was researching Rotary is that Rotary is also heavily, heavily, heavily involved in the insurance industry, which I consider one of the biggest scams against the American people of all time. So I'll leave it at that. But yeah, take some time if you want to, dear audience, and go look up Richard J. Maines in Maricopa County Recorder's Office and follow that little rabbit hole because it's an interesting one. So they start this organization called JustServe. And at the same time, the current LDS prophet, Thomas S. Monson, is receiving the Service Above Self Rotary Award. And you've got this group of people that are past and current, probably current future Mormon leaders. And again, this is part of my story, which is a little bit interesting. I was not expecting to find this today. But what you have is that in 2014, the United Nations holds a day that's really focused and is just for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to come and do presentations. And so it's sort of their official, like you're a part of the club. And the people that show up, though, are really interesting. So you've got Sharon Eubank, who shows up in the Hamblin victim statements documents in that abuse case as the owner of a toy store called Little Dickens, where all the abusers take their kids to this toy store called Little Dickens. And Sharon Eubank and her partner, Mimi Rogers, I believe, own this this toy store. You've got Ahmad, and I don't know if I'm saying that right. It might be Ahmad. I'm not sure, so I apologize. But you've got this Elder Corbett. Now, when I got excommunicated, I was told to study a talk by Elder Corbett that's all about not advocating against the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so it was really fascinating for me to see that Elder Corbett is one of those United Nations, what I'm going to call a Mormotarian, right? And like during COVID, President Nelson came out and said, to be good global citizens, you need to go get vaccinated. And Sharon Eubank and Corbett, and then this guy Colton, who was somehow involved in like nuclear research, and I haven't had time to really look into him. I think it's Phil Colton, but it's a really fascinating group of people. And I'm just going to call these the good global Mormonitarians, because I think it really fits who they are. These are the people that are fully bought in to this generational or multi-generational idea that the church needs to work with organizations like Rotary International, the United Nations, in order to fulfill the mission of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And part of that is being good global citizens and integrating into organizations like Rotary International. So I have a snarky little point here because Russell M. Nelson called the COVID vaccine a literal godsend. I like to say that they were literally sending people to God. I'm going to just go by this for tonight, and we're not going to get into it. But here's what I want to point out, and we're sort of at the end of the presentation here. This is not something that has ever gone away. You've got a skull and bones prophet whose dad was president of Rotary International at the very same time that the United Nations and Rotary International were spinning up their agenda. And it bleeds into my area of expertise in the abuse cases, because in between the time that we met last and today, another major LDS abuse scandal broke involving a woman named Ruth Worthen. And when I went to go research the Ruth Worthen case, what I found is that both the lawyers and the judge in Logan, Utah, are part of Logan Rotary Club. Now, this is a really difficult topic because, like, we all want to be able to affiliate who we want to be able to affiliate with. But look, if Rotary International is receiving millions of dollars from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is receiving all kinds of awards from Rotary International, and you're an abuse victim who's abused by a prominent Mormon family member, do you really want your lawyers and judges to be part of Sigma Chi and Rotary International and Pi Kappa Alpha? Are you really getting a fair shake? Are you really getting justice if you have these people where there are vested interests at play? I just think that's a conversation that we probably need to have, because we saw it play out in the case where Russell M. Nelson's daughter, Brenda Miles, was allegedly part of a child sex abuse ring in Bountiful, and a diagnosed pedophile was allowed to not be disciplined by the church, which led to him marrying a church employee and having children with that woman, and then abusing those children, which led to the eventual disappearance of a young man named Justin Huyman in 2017. So when you mix these worlds and you try to serve two masters, you might end up with situations that are unjust. And I would propose that Russell M. Nelson is neck deep, probably in over his head, in a situation like this, as is the next Mormon prophet, Dallin H. Oaks. So my name is Justin Woolsey Riggs. And Dallin H. Oaks has a major part to play in my family history that involves abuse. So I think it's just a discussion we should be having. The church obviously doesn't think we should be having it, and they excommunicated me so that I can't have that communication with members of my church. You can also see that as JustServe gets spun up, here are the people that are on the advisory council. You have American Red Cross. You have Catholic Relief Services. You have the Post News Group. You have America's Service Commission. You have Rotary International. The CEO of Rotary International is on the JustServe Advisory Council. You have Sharon Eubank. She's the one who's a member of the church. You have Salvation Army. You have whatever this is, the Doblin Group or whatever it is. Then you have, and I can't read these very well, unfortunately. Let's see, if I click on it, I bet I could read them better. Let's take a look. That's not any better, is it? This is ISRAAID, ISRAAID, right? Sitting on this board of directors for JustServe, the Mormon Church's new and shiny service program. So is it good? Is it bad? I mean, I guess that's for Mormons to debate. I don't know. I'm uncomfortable with it personally. I don't like it, especially when I see groups like Provo Rotary promoting people like Sterling Van Wagenen. Sterling Van Wagenen is the man who made the Temple Endowment movies, who later got caught, or who was abusing children, and he was partners with Robert Redford and who married a very prominent Mormon woman. And Sterling Van Wagenen, though, was a sexual abuser. But here you have Provo Rotary Club calling him a famous Utah director. May 24th of this year, Sterling Van Wagenen is in prison for sexually abusing children right now. Why is Provo Rotary Club representing him as a famous Utah director when they should be identifying him as a child sex predator, is my question. Now, what you'll see here is that they've come to see the CEO of what? Angel Studios. And that's going to get you into Tim Ballard land. Yeah. That's going to get you into Glenn Beck land. That's going to get you into all kinds of other crazy things. But what you can see is they're all tied together, right? Mm-hmm. And they don't talk about each other honestly. They call each other famous Utah directors when they're really child sex predators. And I have a problem with that personally. But that's just me, right? Here's the Worth and Sex Abuse Lawyers. If you go to the law firm's website and you go to their About Us page, can you guys see what the symbol is on the light pole out front of the building where they have their offices? That's a Rotary International symbol on that light post. So you can see the influence of Rotary International in Logan, Utah, because some of the most prominent lawyers have the Rotary International sign right out front of their office building.
Wow.
So to tie it, again, just sort of to tie it up here, but just to give you an idea of how closely they're tied, the United Nations literally has a Rotary Day every year. And this year it was the 4th of May, 2024 in Paris, France, with a focus on education and peace. Okay. Now, my scriptures have something to say about people who proclaim peace and safety. Again, I'm not here to preach sermons, but I would certainly invite Mormons to read their scriptures and identify what the scriptures say about people who talk about safety and peace in a time of global upheaval, which is, I think, what we're in. I think it's pretty hard to argue that we're not in a time of global upheaval. So for those people who are interested in religion and think that the Bible might have something to share, like, you might want to read it and you might want to pay close attention to what's happening out in the world, compare it to what your Bible told you was going to happen your whole life, right? And then the last thing I have here is simply this. This is a statement that I think really needs to be heavily investigated and debated inside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because I couldn't disagree more with what David O. McKay said here. Now, David O. McKay said this when Elder Evans was getting ready to take the head of Rotary International in 1966, and a news reporter asked him, well, how do you feel about this? And what David O. McKay said was, the aims of Rotary are compatible with the church. My question is, David O. McKay was the prophet. Is this David O. McKay acting as a prophet and saying that the Lord says that the aims of Rotary International and the United Nations are compatible with the church? Damn. Or is this David O. McKay enjoying black limousines and jet setting in first class to Los Angeles to be taken to the Beverly Hilton Hotel? And what is it? And are the aims of Rotary truly compatible with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or any other church for that matter? I'm not here to tell people what to think, but I do think it's a conversation that needs to happen.
Do they mention what it is that is compatible?
I don't.
Do they ever get into like the reasons why they can even say that? Examples? You know what I'm saying?
Not that I'm aware of, but I think that's a great question for me to go and dig in even further. But I think I can answer on a broad level. Like, if you look at Rotary International as a group of people who are trying to set aside their differences in order to serve others, in order to better the world, then on that level, I think that you can say that the aims of Rotary are compatible with the church. But if the aims of Rotary have to do with the United Nations and one world government and one world religion, then I would argue strongly that the aims of Rotary are not compatible with the church. Now, did David O. McKay know the aims and the mission of Rotary International when he gave this quote? I don't know, and he's dead. He's been dead a long, long time, so nobody can ask him, and we're sort of stuck in a he said, she said situation. But so I think I said this in my first interview, and I'm going to say it again here at the end of this interview. Anybody can say anything, but actions reveal intent. And no matter what people want to debate about what David O. McKay thought about the aims of Rotary being compatible with the church, the actions of the leadership of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for the last 100 years show very clearly that they believe that the aims of Rotary and the United Nations are compatible with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I just don't even think that can be argued at this point with the evidence that I've brought forward here tonight. It's very clear by their actions that they think that these are compatible. Now, why they don't talk about it openly is a question that's open. But I certainly, like, they talk about, like, a lot of members of the church are leaving because of a betrayal of trust. And certainly to me, it feels like a betrayal of trust to read my scriptures and read them one way and go to church and be taught one thing, only to find out that behind my back, church leadership for 100 years has been hobnobbing with Rotary International and the United Nations in an effort to take away my agency and get me to do things like put a COVID vaccine in my arm, or give my money to organizations that end up spending that money on executive salaries, not on helping human beings. And I'm not going to name names here, but like many of the names on that JustServe advisory board have been shown to not really do a ton of great philanthropic work, but their CEOs sure make a lot of money, don't they? As do Mormon prophets and apostles. So my question is, do we find ourselves in a situation where a group of men thought that they had found an organization that lined up with the mission of the church, but really it just lined up with their want and need and desire to fit in with the world and be happy and successful and have a boat in the driveway and do those things? And I mean, I have my opinion about that, and I'll keep it to myself for tonight. But I think it's a conversation that not just Mormons should be having, but Catholics should be having, and Buddhists should be having, and any religious person who chooses to affiliate with the United Nations and Rotary International. I think there needs to be serious conversations going on, because in my experience and in my opinion, those groups do not allow human beings the right and ability to choose for themselves their future. And that's highly problematic for me as a liberty-loving agency. Like I believe in human agency as the bedrock principle of all existence. And so to me, this is deeply problematic and highly controversial, and I think we should be talking about it.
You know what, like, the thing is, too, is that, like, not, I'd love to, like, think that I had the answer for this or that you did. But, like, right. The whole thing is like, I mean, there is obvious, I mean, it's quite obvious there is a serious connection here. You know, and it's just like,
it couldn't be deeper, and it couldn't be more, I mean, blatant, like, right? It's 100 years of history. Like, you can't pretend like it doesn't exist. And I guarantee you that 99.9% of Mormons have no idea that the church has any involvement with Rotary International.
I would just, like, love to know, like, what is, like, some of the real, like, I guess, benefits that we'll probably never know about that friendship. You know what I'm saying? Like, I really just wonder, like, what could really be the more the major reasons why there is this type of relationship. You know, I'm sure there's some stuff that, like, we wouldn't even want to believe might be even the reason why it could be, but who knows? But I'm sure no matter what,
church, for me, it's pretty clear. They were desperate. They were in so far over their head financially, and they desperately wanted to share the gospel with the world, and it wasn't working doing it as a standalone organization. And in order to do what they wanted to do, they had to partner with organizations like Rotary, the CIA, so on and so forth. To me, it's really not hard for the Mormons. I can't speak for why other religions would choose to be a part of it, but for the Mormons, I think it was desperation.
You know, yeah. But I guess really what I'm getting at is, like, what's, like, for the Rotary Club, like, I'm sure they're getting, you know, however this is benefiting them, probably in multiple ways we could never even imagine. You know what I'm saying? Or, like, even the CIA that we were talking about more in, like, episode 1. It's just very
Yeah.
weird. A very weird friendship going on here. I guess if you don't mind, I think that's a perfect place to wrap this up. Thank you very much, man. You did an amazing presentation like you did last time. That was great. The slides, or however you want, I don't even know what you call that timeline that you created. That is great stuff. Again, people, if you have a chance, please check that out. Check out the video. Before we wrap it up, plug your stuff again, please. Let people know where they can find you and some of your work.
Yep. So my website is just LDSabuse.info, and my Twitter handle is @LDSabuse, and those are the two places to find me.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Again, I really do appreciate everything that you did and all the visuals. That's what's up. This was a lot of work. I'm sure maybe down the road, and who knows, and how long, you might be on again with something new. Who knows? But definitely let me know. Definitely let me know what you find in the future, because this is definitely some interesting stuff. And I really do hope at some point when I'm done with the million projects I already have on the back burner, I can actually dig into this and start like looking myself. Because there's like so many things that have come up now that I'm like, oh man, I really need to go back and look for Mormons now. But thanks again. Yeah, and that's it. That is the end of another Occult Rejects. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.